for like a tri bike, like I just can't really see the benefit of a disc brake. When you look at our rim brake wheel, I mean, it's the exact same shape as the disc brake wheel, but there's a brake track on it, right? I mean, that's the only difference.
That's our soundbite right there. That's our soundbite right there. Our disc and our rim are exactly the same. Just one of them, has a rotor and one doesn't. Hey everybody, Nick from TriRig here. A few weeks ago, I posted a video on the merits of rim brakes and the state of disc brakes in our sport, and talked about how, in general, rim brakes, in my opinion, are a bit more optimal a solution in the triathlon space than the disc brakes that have really kind of been pushed on the industry and have sort of taken over the sport. And it resulted in some really lively debate in the comments. The opinions were pretty polarized, and I thought it would be really interesting to talk to someone who knows in depth, really specifically about this space. So with us today is John Thornham, co-founder of FLO Cycling, and John has been in the rim brake and disc brake and design space for over 10 years. His company makes some of the best wheels on the market, and John has spent a ton of time in the design space and in the testing space, and he has probably more wind tunnel hours than most folks that you'll meet. So, John, thank you so much for being with me today. I didn't really prep you much with sort of what I want to talk about, other than to say I wanted to sort of get into the rim versus disc brake debate. But why don't we start? Can you just tell people sort of about the origin of FLO Cycling and what you guys do?
Sure. Yeah, man. I appreciate the intro first. That's very, very kind, very generous. FLO Cycling, what we do. So by trade, I'm a mechanical engineer, and I would say 2009, I guess. I can't even say 20. You don't say 2009. That's a long time ago. Meaning me, I have a twin brother who I started the company with. We were looking at something to do. My brother was a triathlete, and he bought a set of race wheels, and he brought them home one day and said, man, these are pretty awesome. I said, oh, okay, they're cool. And he said, what do you think they cost? And I said, I don't know, $500. And then he told me he spent like $2,500, and I just thought he was absolutely nuts. So from there, he said, do you think we could start a company? And I said, yes. And then that's kind of how it started. I've designed all the wheels that we've ever made. And back when we first started FLO, I mean, everything was rim brake. There was really no disc brake back then. So it's something that we didn't even consider. But since then, we now design rim brake and disc brake wheels. They're very similar, but there are some key differences. So yeah, I definitely like each for their own reasons. But for the most part, in the tri world, I would probably have to agree with Nick, but probably some benefits to rim.
So let's talk about this. You guys started the company with the idea we can design better wheels or equivalent wheels for a lower cost. And along the way, you started discovering you could actually make better wheels in general than even what was out there. I remember when your sort of second generation of wheels came out that were full carbon rather than fairings attached. I think you went through kind of a phenomenal design phase using a whole cluster of CFD simulations to go through hundreds of different shapes to find, the optimal shape for the tire and the rim, etc. So what I'm really interested in is take me back to that time as you're going through simulations of optimal shapes for this wheel. The question is, does the existence of a braking track on a rim braking wheel affect how you had to design that whatsoever? The shapes that you could accomplish, the aerodynamic gains that you could find. Does the rim brake have any effect on that? Because what I've told people is it doesn't. You don't have a handicap trying to design a rim brake, but I'd like to hear your perspective on it.
Yeah. I think the first thing, like when we went back, go back looking at the design phase, I mean, what we did is we said, we're going to collect like a bunch of real world data to see what we can design with. And so I built this computer mounted to the front of a bike, and we collected two things. One was the yaw angle, basically the angle of the wind as it hits you. So, right in your nose is 0, and each one of yours would be like plus 90 and minus 90. So just a little bit would be like plus 5, minus 5. The old world thought was kind of that, 80% of your time was spent between minus 20 and plus 20, or somewhere between 10 and 20 on both sides. And we kind of debunked that. 80% of your time is between minus 5 and plus 5. So it's much shallower than most people think. And the second thing we gathered was relative velocity. So most people think that, hey, my Garmin says that I'm going 15 miles an hour. That's how fast I'm going, and that's what matters aerodynamically. That's just not true. Everything is based on relative velocity. So you have to account for the wind. So if I'm going 15 miles an hour ground speed, but I have a 5-mile-an-hour headwind, you add the two of those together. So you'd be going 20 miles an hour relatively. That's what the aerodynamics would see. If you had a 5-mile-an-hour tailwind in that situation, you would minus the 5 from the 15, so you'd only be going 10 miles per hour relatively from an aero perspective. We then use all of that data and we put it in this algorithm because in aerodynamics, when you're studying a shape, historically what people would do is they would take like 10 different designs and they would go to a wind tunnel and they kind of mock up these different shapes. They can be in anything. It doesn't really matter what the material is. But they would test those like 10 different rim shapes and they would say, oh, this is the fastest one. The problem with that is there's no equation to solve for what's fast. So you need to figure out what is fast by testing, and you have to test and test and test and test. So we used a supercomputer and we gave it a parameter set. And so the parameter set is basically a box of dimensions that we wanted to design a certain depth rim in. And one of those dimensions is really the biggest issue that we have when designing wheels is there's a limiter from a width perspective. So today, especially with brakes like tri-rig brakes, they open up so wide, right? We're not really concerned with, yes, exactly. We're not concerned with the width of a brake track, but we used to be, right? Because we could only go so wide because there was a limiter there. I can tell you though, that even if I'm looking at a rim brake wheel or a disc brake wheel with carbon fiber, you can shape the profile of the rim to be whatever you want. And then you just kind of align your brake pads to match up with that. When you look at an aluminum rim, we did some kind of interesting stuff with aluminum rims where what we were doing is we didn't have straight sidewalls. We were angling the sidewalls to give us more of a profile to lead in.
So it'd be more continuous with the shape of the rim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You don't want this sort of straight section and then you kind of come up bulbous. We were shaping the rim to do to make it as aero as possible. And you do see a difference there because you have there's a bonded section and there's a step, and we try to make that as smooth as possible. But you can only get so smooth when it comes to this sort of stuff. But in carbon fiber, I say, that it all goes away. The only thing that ever changes on a carbon rim is if it's been braked heavily over time. So you are changing the surface when you brake, especially if you pick up stuff. You can get a rougher surface on the brake track. Now, every wear pattern would be somewhat different. But again, in triathlon, we don't really brake that much, right? So it's not like heavy braking where you're getting this change. And in some situations, depending on tire and depending on the actual wind condition, it may end up being faster. It may end up being slower. We don't know. We've tested tires with different wear volumes on them. We've tested a whole number of different things, and there are differences, but they're not necessarily consistent based on what you see. So,
okay,
honestly,
so let me
back to your question. There's no difference.
So let me try and summarize here. So I hear you saying that in your original design phase for sort of several generations of wheels ago, when you were only designing rim brakes, you didn't find any design constraints based on the fact that it was a rim brake. You had a constraint for width based on available brakes at the time that could only open so wide, basically.
Correct.
And so comparing that without that design constraint, maybe you could find some additional speed. But as long as we're saying, hey, the brake can open at least, 35 millimeters or so, then you're saying you can't really find any additional speed there. The only thing maybe you could say is, hey, rim brakes have the potential to alter the surface texture of the brake track, but in your experience as a wheel manufacturer, having customers that put tens of thousands of miles on their rims. Have you ever had one come back where you say, hey, this has been clearly diminished in some way by the fact that a rim brake pad has been wearing on this brake track?
No, I mean, yeah, if you grew up in the Pacific Northwest and you're riding your wheels in the wintertime, I mean, I've seen some pretty hollowed out stuff. Generally, it's on aluminum. But again, like people that are using race wheels, like you just don't, I mean, the rim will wear out. That's one negative of a rim brake wheel is that they do wear out. But again, when I say, like, when you go back to triathlon wheels and like most people on tri bikes, they might break a turnaround and then they come back and they break a, T2. Like that's it, right? There's really not much going on there. So it's really a non-issue, in my opinion.
Would you say, so let's play devil's advocate here and say, well, I'm someone who trains a lot as well, and I'm only going to have one set of wheels because I don't want to buy two different sets, and I'm going to train on these all the time. I guess in that circumstance, you could say, hey, you may want to be careful if you live in an area with a lot of gravel or poor road conditions, and you're putting tens of thousands of miles and grinding pebbles into your carbon rims. You could say, sure, that guy might be a candidate for rim brakes, or for disc brakes, I'm sorry, if he lives in an area with absolutely horrible roads and he's only going to have one set of wheels and he never wants to, change them out. So when we used to, what I used to say, when we used to make an aluminum and a carbon wheel, I got to the point where I started having a really difficult time recommending an aluminum rim for anything, right? Because when we first started back in like 2012, when we released the first product line, carbon fiber and the epoxy resin systems and the heat management and everything that you look at from a carbon rim perspective wasn't 100% of the way there for us to start a company and be super confident that like we weren't going to have issues. Fast forward, 4 or 5 years down the road when we launched the second generation, major advances in epoxy resin systems, major advances in carbon fiber and braking technology. We were 100% comfortable with it. At that time, especially once we released the current generation of wheels that we're on now, we have other additional benefits where we're able to put more weight on a carbon rim. We look at all of even our road stuff, we call it all sport because you can take it off road. It's tougher. It's just designed better. There's a lot of improvements over a decade of not only wheel design improvements that we've made, but also like carbon and epoxy changes and layup changes that we've made as well. So I think the only reason that I ever recommended an aluminum rim was like if you are in a place, and I always say it's basically for winter riding, when areas are basically, they have to choose if they're going to use sand or salt for snow removal. Some areas don't allow for salt and they can only use sand, and it's wet. Pacific Northwest of the United States, or like, British Columbia area, like Vancouver, is traditionally wet. And they use sand for snow control. And so what happens is you go out and you start riding, and obviously the water and the sand picks up and it gets on the surface of the rim. It gets on your brake pads and you brake. And all of a sudden you get this, I don't know why this thing does this. I really saw some like fireworks going on here. So you get this like sandpaper that basically just rips into the surface. And I don't care if it's aluminum. I don't care if it's carbon fiber. I've had people that have sent me pictures where they've blown right through the aluminum rim. And then again, that's only in those conditions. If you're using sand or salt, we don't see it. But today, like the only reason that I would say, hey, maybe if you are going to go ahead and pick a bike and you live in the Pacific Northwest and you're going to ride all year round, disc brakes. Beyond that, for like a tri bike, like I just can't really see the benefit of a disc brake bike. And let's go a little bit more to the aerodynamic side, because I know you've done just an extraordinary amount of testing. And what's so interesting to me is that there's aero gains that people lose that because they're just not paying attention, both for the aero side and the rolling resistance side, which is something that I know you have spent a ton of time and attention on, and the guys at Silka do as well, that you're finding you can get so much more benefit out of just making sure your tires are at the appropriate PSI versus, $1,000 difference between rim A and rim B. But tell me about, have you done any aero testing of disc versus rim in the tunnel, or have your tests been more focused on the rolling resistance side and the tire width aero side?
I mean, we've done both, right? I mean, for me, the big question was, as we started to release rims that were, when you look at our rim brake wheel, I mean, it's the exact same shape as the disc brake wheel, but there's a brake track on it, right? I mean, that's the only difference. So the big thing for me was, well, that's our
soundbite right there. That's our soundbite right there. Our disc and our rim are exactly the same. Just one of them, has a rotor and one doesn't. Yeah,
one doesn't. And so when you look at it it's 2 watts. I mean, we lose 2 watts by putting that big honking rotor out there. What just kind of fascinates me, and I've never really understood why we even have this debate half the time, is like, if I have something in an airstream, right, airflow, and one of them has a big rotor on there, and then the other one, we take the rotor away, which one's going to be faster, right? Which one produces more drag? Which one produces less drag?
And you can potentially remove spokes as well.
You can, and we do take spokes out. So we go on the front wheel specifically, because when you brake on a rim brake wheel, you're stopping at the edge, right? So you can do a radial lacing, you can do a whole number of different things. But when you stop at the rotor, then you have to basically account for that force transferring up to the surface of the road, right? Which is the tire. So we have to build with more spokes. It's a different lacing pattern. There are differences there. So, I mean, going back to what I'm saying, like when you put the rotor on or take the rotor off, it's like saying, okay, I'm going to go stand in the wind tunnel and see what my drag is. And then all of a sudden I'm going to leave the wind tunnel and see what is my drag then. Well, my drag then is 0. Like, I mean, we've just taken this whole body like right out of the picture. It's gone. And the great thing with rim brakes is that if it's designed well, I mean, you guys have, I love your rim brake. I always have. But the way you design it, it's kind of up and it's out of the way. You can do so many different things where yes, there's still something on the bike, but if it's designed properly, like even in a fork, like you can completely hide them in the fork. And the amount of time that you actually pull the brake and it comes out of the fork and stops is like 0.0001% of the time of riding, right? So it's out of the slipstream. And if you don't have a bike like that, then the way you guys have basically designed yours to just go with the frame of the bike anyway, it makes 100% sense, but that those rotors will cost you. And then that doesn't even include the caliper arm not the caliper arm, not even the caliper itself or the cabling that comes down or all that different stuff. That's just the wheel alone. So from a bike to bike perspective, we don't do a lot of bike testing in the wind tunnel just because it's not our focus. And there's so many variables. It just doesn't make any sense. But the wheel alone will cost you about 2 watts.
Got it. That's just the rotor basically. And I think that's what you were saying without necessarily a change in spokes. That would be wheels with identical spokes, lacing patterns?
No, that's including the spoke difference because we don't build them. It's really difficult to do that. But honestly, the difference, we've looked at spoke differences like Clydesdale versus regular, and we're talking like very small. It's not huge. The majority, I would say 95% probably is going to be from that rotor. So it's a big deal. It's huge.
At least 2 watts, and then you go up from there. Yeah.
Yep. And you look at different rotor sizes, and what are we doing with rotors? I mean, rotors are generally getting bigger. We started at 140, now we're going to 160. Do I see maybe an increase in the future? Maybe. I mean, again, if we're really arguing about like braking performance in triathlon, you can't convince me that we have a braking problem issue, especially in triathlon with a well-designed rim brake. I just don't see it.
And is that 2 watts per wheel?
That's 2 watts for the system.
Okay.
We look at the combo.
2 wheels, like a bike. Okay. Got it. That's amazing, man. John, where can people find out more about FLO Cycling and everything that you guys do?
Yeah, man. FLOcycling.com, just FLOCYCLING.com. We've been there. You can find us there. We'll be there. Instagram, we're all that stuff as well. So if you want to check us out, definitely check us out.
Yeah. And you guys have a podcast, and you've done some amazing things in the tire inflation space as well, which I think is fantastic. Mm-hmm. You guys have a relatively new pump and gauge system that's really awesome. Yep. People should definitely check that out. You can easily go, what, plus or minus 10 watts just based on good tire pressure?
So here's the general rule. I mean, if you think of PSI, right? For every 1 PSI that you are overinflated, you lose a watt. So if you're 20 PSI over, you're losing 20 watts.
Yeah. Wow.
And like most people, like the traditional, like, oh, I need to be at 120. I need to be at 120.
No.
And most people probably need to be around 80. You're looking at 40 watt loss.
Yeah.
It's huge.
Wow. And most frame manufacturers are like, look what we did. We found 5 watts compared to our old frame. And here you are overinflating by 4 times, 10 times, 8 times that much. Wow.
One of the cool stories that I always like to tell is that there is a pro athlete in 2016 that was at Ironman Kona, and American, great athlete, never won Kona. And we had just done a big tire study where we started to look at rolling resistance and aerodynamics. And so he was using a gator skin, and aerodynamically, gator skins are like screaming fast. It like blows me away. But what I learned was that they are probably the worst rolling resistance tire that's out there, especially when your tire pressures are high. And most people in Kona do this. The reason a lot of people will use a gator skin at Kona is because it's just notorious for like this steel belted radial that like sits on the road and you get a lot of punctures. Yeah. But over that course alone, you'll lose at least 8 minutes just choosing that tire versus another tire. And that pro lost the entire race.
Have a last name that rhymes with Watts?
You never know. Yeah, he lost the entire race by less than 8 minutes. And so, you look at tire selection, and this is why, like, people will say, hey, it's only 2 watts. But when you get to that pointy end of the field, it is, and you talked about Silk. I mean, I love those guys and what they do over there. Their podcast is called Marginal Gains, right? It's about these small little incremental gains. And that's really what our whole podcast is about, is becoming faster in these small incremental things. I did this webinar now. It's called a cycling efficiency webinar. And, it's about, you look at training, right? You can only get so fast from a training perspective. And then from there, it's all about converting as many of the watts as you put into the pedals and moving you forward, not wasted in some other capacity. It can be up and down over bumps in the road because your tire pressure is too high. It can be lost in aerodynamics. It can be lost all over the place, but very, very important. And that's what we do.
John, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being with us. I'm sure people will have more questions for you. And anybody who wants to opine in the comments, please let us know. But thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you next time.
All right, buddy. See ya.